Thank you. Okay, so let me introduce Maria. We're really fortunate today to have Dr. Maria Treadaway as our speaker. Maria currently holds a teaching position at the University of Auckland in the School of Cultures, Languages and Linguistics. She brings quite a rare combination of skills to language testing because she's both a pilot and an applied linguist. She gained her commercial pilot's license in 2001 and has combined these skills in her PhD project on which she will be presenting today. Her thesis recently won the 2023 Jacqueline Ross TOEFL Dissertation Award, which is an enormously prestigious international competitive award for PhD theses in language testing and assessment. Maria has also other skills. She's, for example, an experienced sailor. She teaches children to sail and has recently sailed from the Philippines to Bermuda as a crew of an around-the-world yacht race. So maybe that will be her next specific purpose testing project in the making. Maria will talk for about 40 minutes or slightly less, and so there should be plenty of time for questions. So without further ado, let's welcome today's speaker, Maria Treadaway.
Hello, everybody. I'll just share my screen. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ko Maria Treadaway, tōku ingoa. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Maria Treadaway, and I'm speaking to you from Auckland, New Zealand. And I'm going to talk about my doctoral project, which was to develop and validate the Overseas Flight Training Preparation Test, or OFTPT. And at its core, this study was an applied project to develop a test to measure the linguistic readiness of ab initio cadet pilots from non-English speaking backgrounds to engage successfully in their practical flight training programs conducted in English. And I'm sure you do know, but just in case, ab initio means from the beginning. So we're talking about student pilots and who have already completed their ground school theoretical training and then are ready to transition into practical flight training. And cadet is referring to the fact that a lot of the participants were being sponsored in their study by an airline. So I'll give you a bit of background for the motivation for the study. At present, there are no standardised measures of language ability to assess ab initio cadet pilots from non-English speaking backgrounds who are entering practical flight training. Instead, each individual training organisation adopts their own testing and entry requirements, and this results in an ad hoc approach to assessing linguistic readiness, which is actually contrasts the otherwise robust and standardized assessment of the skills and abilities in other areas of their training. So consequently, the aviation education sector has signaled the need for a valid, reliable and standardized measurement tool calibrated to the International Civil Aviation Organization's Language Proficiency Rating Scale, that's the international standard, to assist in establishing comparable quality standards across organizations with the aim of minimizing the negative consequences experienced by student pilots, by the sponsoring airlines and the training organizations when students are granted entry onto a program when they're not linguistically ready. So in response, this project involved the development and validation of the Overseas Flight Training Preparation Test, or OFTPT. And the test consists of a listening, a reading, and a speaking module. There are 2 forms. And the main output of the project is a fully operational test. It's administered online, which specifically targets the needs of ab initio pilots embarking on their practical flight training. And it's aligned with the ICAO Language Proficiency Rating Scale, or the LTRC. And the test focuses on the important diagnostic function of testing in this environment. So test scores can be interpreted as levels of readiness to engage in practical flight training. So a student is either ready, minimally ready, or not ready. And these levels of readiness have been empirically linked to the ICAO rating scale. And this is the first time that threshold levels of language proficiency within this target language use domain have been linked to the scale. And from a theoretical standpoint, this study is the first work to merge two well-established approaches to validation and assessment, that of Bachman and Palmer's assessment use argument and O'Sullivan and Ware's socio-cognitive framework. So as such, the extended descriptions of the design and operationalization of the OFTPT in phase 2 or in chapter 5 of the dissertation could serve as a useful blueprint for ESP or LSP test developers, and particularly aviation test developers, because the chapter also includes detailed test specifications for each module. So the research aims in the study were first concerned with identifying test content and tasks that resemble real-life activities. And then the focus shifted to transforming these target language use tasks into test tasks so that the learning within the domain would be naturally reflected in a test that aimed for situational and interactive authenticity that was transparent to the stakeholders. And then finally, the aim was to identify threshold levels of language proficiency and set appropriate standards for the target language use domain or performance on these tests. So to achieve these aims, the creation of the OFTPT test encompassed 4 phases. Phase 1 was an a priori definition of the construct and resulting from an investigation of the target language use domain. Phase 2 involved test development and construction of the test, guided by the 2 validation frameworks, that of Bachman and Palmer and O'Sullivan and Ware's socio-cognitive framework. Phase 3 involved test piloting with Chinese and Japanese ab initio pilots. And then phase 4 involved the scoring and standard setting in conjunction with subject matter experts. So the context of the research was international. There was a total of 185 participants, and data were gathered from 154 ab initio pilots in phases 1 and 3 in China and Japan, 21 flying instructors, that was in phase 1 and phase 4, and 9 English language experts in phase 1 and phase 4, and 1 air traffic controller in phase 1. And the subject matter experts were recruited from Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, and the United States. So now I'll give you a very brief summary of the methodology and outcomes for each of these 4 phases. So the first phase involved an investigation of the target language use domain, encompassing multiple insider perspectives. Quantitative data was collected from a survey of 56 ab initio cadets from China and Japan, and qualitative data was collected in semi-structured interviews of 12 subject matter experts, including an air traffic controller, 2 aviation English specialists, and 9 flying instructors. And the investigation of the target language use domain revealed that listening comprehension is the primary challenge and should be the primary focus for students. And this comprehension is underpinned by technical vocabulary, which can be accessed with ease and contextualized connected speech. So listening comprehension was followed very closely by the need for speaking skills, focused on interactive competence in everyday and training situations with peers and instructors. And specifically, instructors wanted their students to ask more questions, and there was a perception of a lack of engagement from their students, mostly taking the form of a hesitance to ask questions or to admit to not understanding. Reading skills were also identified by all participants as being essential to address the theoretical aspects of a private pilot license syllabus. In addition, both students and flying instructors have limited experience of other cultures because of their relative youth. They're quite young. So consequently, they're heavily influenced by the teaching and learning expectations of their own culture, which at times caused a misalignment in what instructors and students expected from each other. So the challenge is that students have to be able to operationalize their content knowledge and adjust to the different cultural expectations impacting on communication with their instructors in order to engage successfully. But then instructors need to develop their engagement skills with students, and organizations need to recognize the significant impact of culture on learning. So this investigation of the target language use domain had clear implications for the design of the OFTPT. Firstly, a diagnostic testing purpose was adopted in line with the principles of learner-oriented assessment, which seeks to foster the attitudes and the dispositions needed for lifelong learning. And feedback within score reports was to direct test takers to remedial learning activities based on their test performance, thereby supporting the future development of necessary linguistic knowledge, skills, and abilities for practical flight training. Secondly, because reading skills had been identified as essential by all of the participants, a reading test module was included, despite this skill not being incorporated in the aviation English construct defined by the ICAO scale. The listening test also included situationally and interactionally authentic texts containing standard phraseologies between pilots and air traffic controllers, technical vocabulary, and different accents. And again, the ICAO scale doesn't reflect the use of standard phraseologies, which are fundamental in aviation English. In fact, the whole language proficiency requirements discourage the testing of standard phraseologies, saying that this language is assessed by subject matter experts as part of the training procedures within the aviation industry. But standard phraseologies differ from the use of natural languages, phonologically, lexically, semantically, discursively, and syntactically. In other words, they must be consciously learned by student pilots, and that includes native speakers, because a lack of proficiency at this level seriously jeopardizes efficient and safe operations in all phases of flight. So finally, the speaking test was designed to maximize interaction and comprehension of instructional information, and it contains role plays between air traffic controllers and flying instructors that require negotiation and the comprehension of potentially unknown technical information. So including these elements was intended to tap into the interactive competence by compelling test takers to declare their non-comprehension and to ask and answer questions to clarify and demonstrate their understanding. Also, because instructors had reported very large variation in the speaking competence of students who were entering training and who had been awarded the same ICAO level, I devised a specific rating, some specific rating procedures that divided the ICAO levels into high, mid, and lower bands of achievement, just because I wanted to provide more diagnostic guidance and to give an indication of where a test taker is within an ICAO level. So I decided to rate each speaking task separately and show the individual ICAO levels for each criterion, as well as an overall level for that task. So to arrive at the overall ICAO level for each task, to reflect the non-compensatory scoring model that the ICAO scale adopts, the lowest level awarded on any criteria becomes a test taker's final level. However, in this example that you can see, if all the levels are added and averaged, so we've got 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 3, that's 17. So the mean is 2.83. So the performance is closer to a level 3 than a level 2. So therefore, the overall level is indicated as level 2, but high. Using the same kind of calculations, the descriptors mid and low are also used to describe the final level. And then to arrive at the overall ICAO level across the whole speaking test, I took the mean performance level on each criteria, and then I added it, each criterion mean, and then averaged this. So in this case, of the performance results shown in this grid, the mean of the pronunciation was 3.3, and then we've got a mean of 4 for structure, a mean of 3.5 for vocab, and so on. So the overall mean is 3.74. So this performance is closer to a level 4 than a level 3, and therefore the overall level would be indicated as level 3 high. So that gives you a bit of background as to how I applied the scale to the speaking tests. And if you're wondering why in task 2 the structure and the vocabulary are blacked out, it's because of the task. I didn't rate these criteria because of the task design. So with these implications in mind, the aim of phase 2 was to construct an assessment use argument, which formed the conceptual foundation of the OFTPT. And this foundation was then developed using O'Sullivan and Ware's socio-cognitive framework to consider the contextual and cognitive parameters and their interplay with test taker characteristics. And the theoretical groundwork generated by combining the two frameworks resulted in detailed test specifications, which explain and outline essential aspects of the test content, the format, and the methods. In essence, they provide a definition of the construct for this target language use domain. And this is significant because the ICAO language proficiency requirements policy doesn't provide aviation test developers with a centralized construct definition for either training or professional environments. And this has resulted in widely varying interpretations in the design, in the scoring, and in the standards of aviation tests, which have caused ongoing threats to the meaningfulness, reliability, and validity of many aviation tests. This has been going on since Alderson did a survey in 2008 and as recently as 2021. So the test development activities in this phase 2, address this issue of validity. The test specifications were operationalized with activities focused on constructing and quality checking 2 forms of the OFTPT. And I built a companion test website as well to provide information about the OFTPT written for primary and secondary stakeholders. In plain language, there's sample test items and sample score reports and learning activities, and they're all organized by language, skill, and topic. And you can see the address there on the page. So in phase 3, the tests were trialed with 52 Japanese and 46 Chinese ab initio pilots. And then final forms of the OFTPT were created based on item analysis from the trials. And the trialing also addressed research question 2, because the item analysis addresses the scoring validity of the OFTPT. So test data were analysed and evaluated with classical test theory for their facility, their discrimination and reliability. But because the OFTPT is essentially a criterion reference test with categories of readiness forming the criterion, the quality, the technical quality of items was considered alongside an evaluation of the item's importance to sampling content within the target language use domain. And this analysis and evaluation demonstrated that the difficulty of the test items across listening and reading appeared to be well matched with the range of knowledge, skills, and abilities possessed by test takers, and for this diagnostic purpose, mean facility of 0.69, and that the test discriminates between higher and lower ability with a mean point biserial of 0.46. And both the listening and reading tests have excellent reliability with a mean alpha of 0.93. So because I had decided to use the existing ICAO scale as the measure of proficiency, the challenge became how to set standards and identify a threshold level of proficiency needed to succeed in practical flight training based on test scores from the OFTPT, and then to relate these standards and level to a scale that was primarily designed for certification purposes and professional operational environments. And to do this, 19 subject matter experts participated in 3 interdependent stages to set these standards. So the aim of stage 1 was to investigate the inter-rater reliability and inter-rater agreement of the rated speaking test samples that I collected during test trials. And this was necessary for 2 reasons. Firstly, establishing the IRR and IRA was needed because this was to build the foundation of subsequent standard setting activities. So there were implications for the validity of the standards that would eventually be arrived at. But the second objective was to interrogate the validity of using the ICAO scale in a training context and for a diagnostic testing purpose. And I did this by comparing the OFTPT speaking test ratings awarded by me and following those rating procedures I developed in phase 2 and told you about, with those awarded by a rater of a test designed to certify pilots and air traffic controllers, namely the LPAC. And we compared all of our ratings for 10 samples encompassing 190 rating decisions in total. And the reliability was excellent, suggesting that a standard interpretation of the scale was achieved despite the different contexts of use and testing purpose. So with the reliability established, the next step was in articulating and defining 3 performance categories, conceptualized as ready, minimally ready, and not ready, which forms the basis for interpreting the test scores from the OFTPT. And these categories were captured in performance level descriptors. And I needed to do this for 2 reasons. So firstly, the PLDs would serve as a shared point of reference in conceptualizing performance of test takers. And this was needed to conduct the subsequent ABLE procedures. And secondly, the way I elicited the definitions made explicit the correspondence between the ICAO levels and linguistic performance within the target language use domain. And this allowed me to inferentially link the objectively scored listening and reading test to the scale, also in the ABLE standard setting session. So the PLDs were empirically derived. I invited 6 flying instructors, I considered these subject matter experts, to listen to and comment on 11 extracts taken from the speaking test performances. And these extracts represented the range of abilities which had been double rated in stage 1, the previous stage. And these procedures were very closely based on NOC's 2014 validation of the ICAO scale. So in terms of findings, test takers judged as not ready, test takers judged as not ready scored at ICAO level 3, low or below. Minimally ready test takers were rated between level 3 low and level 3 high. And those assessed as ready were rated at level 3 high and above. And the implication of these indicative ICAO ranges for organizations using the scale as an entry measure is that the scale isn't finely grained enough to reflect the distinctions in performance that might determine the readiness of a student to begin flight training, because these 3 performance levels are all captured within level 3, ICAO level 3. Also, in terms of what was important to instructors when they were judging performance, i.e. the indigenous assessment criteria, their concerns reflected a much broader construct than that captured in the ICAO scale. And in particular, the comments were quite focused on the impact of language ability on safety and the negative consequences experienced by individuals and organizations when training is delayed due to poor language proficiency. So their comments encompassed a much more holistic lens. So finally, the foundational work in stage 1 and 2 was used to set standards, to validate test content, and to determine cut scores on the OFTPT listening and reading tests using the ABLE method of standard setting. And then these cut scores were inferentially linked to the ICAO language proficiency rating scale by means of the PLDs, the performance level descriptors. So the ultimate goal of the ABLE method, or in this context, is for subject matter expert judges to make estimates of the likely performance of a test taker at particular levels of performance for items that have been categorized for their importance and for their difficulty. And for the method to work, the judges must have an intimate knowledge of the target language use domain and the target test takers. So I recruited 6 flying instructors and 6 aviation English specialists, and then I divided them into 2 panels so that the replicability of the procedures and the decisions could be compared. And panelists did 2.5 hours of online training and then participated in a 1.5 hour panel discussion. So as part of the ABLE procedures, I surveyed the participants about their impressions of the processes and the outcomes. And these feedback surveys indicate that all aspects of the standard setting were successful. Our panelists judged the test content as being highly relevant to the target language use domain. And they had a lot of confidence in the procedures followed to generate the cut scores and in the cut scores that were eventually produced. Statistically, inter-panelist consistency in making judgments of performance was excellent, and there were no significant differences in cut scores within the 2 groups generated, suggesting that test users can also have confidence in the standards set on the OFTPT. So in summary, I've come to the end. And just to recap, at its core, this is an applied test development project initiated in response to calls from industry for a valid, reliable, and standardized measurement tool calibrated to the ICAO language proficiency rating scale. So as a result, I created the OFTPT. It's a fully operational test by merging Bachman and Palmer's AUA and O'Sullivan and Ware's socio-cognitive framework. Kua mutu aku kōrero I tēnei wā, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was super interesting. We've got a lot of time for questions, which is good. So yeah, as I said earlier, if you have a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom.
And while we're my curtains, sorry, it's really bright.
Yes. While we're waiting for people to raise their hands for questions, I might start off with a question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you use the assessment use argument and the socio-cognitive WEA framework instead of other validation frameworks that are available, something like evidence-centered design, which seems quite suitable for a project like your own, or Kane's argument-based validation framework.
I looked at both of those frameworks, Uta, and this is being really honest. The evidence-centered design just looks so technical with the statistics and the calculation of like the latent trait ability. And the Kane's was just a little bit more arcane, funnily enough. It just seemed, those two seemed quite intellectual, and I understood Bachman and Palmer's AUA, and basically, and the O'Sullivan and Ware is really easy because it's a checklist. And so the way that I use them both, that for me they were accessible, like intellectually accessible. They were technically accessible. I used the AUA as like the big picture, just thinking in in terms, like it starts with the consequences and then just drills down. And then when it gets really fuzzy on the drilling down, that's where the socio-cognitive framework works really well, because it just bit by bit you build up your basically your definition of your construct by just ticking off, yes, I've done this, I've considered these, I've considered this into these interactions. So yeah, it was basically I looked very closely actually at the evidence-centered design, because I thought that looked really promising, but I just personally didn't feel like I had the statistical expertise to pull it off successfully. Although I can see that it was, I considered it quite closely. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I've got a follow-up question. Oh, sorry, we've got lots of time, so I hope I'm not taking time away from others' question. But I feel like what you're describing is more that you used it as a basis for test development rather than validation purposes. So this sort of checklist thing, because I think that's how we, for example, actually developed it too, because I found it really hard to find the validation parts in his book as opposed to the test development part of his framework. So yeah.
I think it is. I think it's actually both, because when you are developing a test and when you're thinking about like all of the things that all of the evidence that you could use for validity to show the processes for the different types of validity, it really is a kind of a everyday process of bringing together and making those small decisions that lead up to the big decisions that kind of show that, yes, I have actually considered the scoring validity, or I have actually considered important features of test development and how they impact on the interpretation of test scores within the domain.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Jason and Ivy had one. They put their hand up before.
Did they?
Oh, was that just a wave?
Yeah, I think it was the clapping.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Well, if no one else has a question, I'll continue. I was wondering, and I may have missed it, but I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about the kind of complexities of standard setting to something that has construct problems. So, right, so the ICAO scale obviously has real issues, and setting standards to something that's construct both mis and underrepresenting has its own problems. And I was wondering, I haven't read your thesis yet. I will make sure to do that at some point, but I wonder if you talk more about that in the thesis.
I kind of talk about the problems of the ICAO scale, absolutely. And rather than addressing like the fact that it's incomplete, it doesn't reflect the construct particularly well. It reflects some parts of the construct. Rather than that, I kind of went from the point of view of the indigenous assessment criteria, because I use subject matter experts in the standard setting for the development of the performance level descriptors, and also from those descriptors, the development of in the ABLE standard setting session. And so basically I was using my test, which had been the definition of the construct came from an investigation of the construct. There was, even though I had kind of the scale, the performance level descriptors kind of became like an alternative scale alongside the ICAO scale that expanded. They do expand on the construct within the ICAO scale. So it was like a fusion of the performance level descriptors being that point of reference and conceptualization of like performance at a ready stage, performance at minimally ready, and performance at below but not ready. And yeah, it was the subject matter experts who overcame that hurdle by just setting their own standards. And because those performance level descriptors were based on performances of the speaking test that had been rated with the ICAO scale, then I could kind of inferentially link and go, okay, well, these performances were judged at level 3 and they were kind of higher level 3. And with these other subject matter experts have said that they are ready. So we'll say that high level 3 is ready.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Joanna.
Hi, Joanna.
Oh,
she's gone. Bye, Joanna.
Great question. Anyone else while Joanna hopefully comes back in?
So we can't hear Joanna. So I've got I didn't raise my hand,
Oh.
sorry.
I thought she disappeared altogether.
Oh, I can see her, but I can't hear her. Shall I
Okay, Sally,
ask a
yes,
question?
go.
It's not really a question, but more just something I'm thinking about, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about it. I think you were talking about standard phraseology and how important that is. I think, did you say you did include it in your listening assessment? So in your when you were doing your needs analysis in stage 1, was this something that was sort of contentious or something that the people you consulted were concerned with, whether or not it should be included in the test?
It never came up as a concern. So I did it from 2 sides, Sally. So I in my survey of the students, I basically said, what's your standard phraseology like? Do you know the ICAO alphabet? Can you make a position call? Can you make a startup call? Can you make a takeoff call? And they just rated themselves of how well they could do it. So I had kind of their perspective, and very interestingly, they were a lot more confident than what the instructors said that they were. So one of the things that came out was that the ab initios that I surveyed had more confidence in their theoretical ability, but then actually when they went into real world environments, it was a little bit bravado. It wasn't actually backed up by being operational or proceduralized. And when interviewing the flying instructors, they absolutely said, we have to spend so much time in pre-flight briefings going through all of the calls. They have to know the standard phraseologies. And so it's kind of, for me, a no-brainer to prepare that, because it's really stressful when you are like in the plane learning stuff to actually have to concentrate on things that should just be automatic. And it's a fundamental a matter of situational awareness, because the situational awareness is your ability to conceptualize the airspace. So where you are, where other people are, and where they're going to be in the future. That's a listening skill, first and foremost. It's a cognitive skill, but it's that cognitive skill's completely based on your ability to process what you hear. And what you're processing most of the time is standard phraseologies. So,
but to what extent is that knowledge and the skills and abilities something that should be developed through the course of their training, or should they be ready with that right at the very beginning? Because these are, at the beginning of their training, they're cadets. That's sort of the questions that I'm thinking about. Yeah,
I think it's absolutely a skill that is developed through every pilot. Even if you ask a 747 Air New Zealand captain, they'll be saying, I develop my situational awareness all the time. So it's an ongoing skill. The ab initios that I was working with, they would have had at least 1 and usually 2 years of intensive theoretical ground training. So they have a lot of content knowledge, including standard phraseologies that they've learned from within the classroom. So personally, I think to a great extent, they should have the basics. They should be able to use standard phraseologies to a large extent before they start their practical flight training.
Could think of it as
so it's just going to make it so much easier.
So like a threshold that they should be already over. Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And the questions that I was asking were very simple. They were all about like, is this person on the ground, in the air, or in the traffic pattern, the circuit pattern, or in the training area, just based on you know, clues in the text. Did you have a question, Joanna?
So Joanna wrote in the chat, she said, any advice on working with SMEs on standard setting?
It was, I tell you, it was really, sometimes it was really feisty. My advice is, I did a lot of training beforehand and was quite active and saying, oh, have you started those activities, and looking at the different conversations, because the training was all online, but it was so asynchronous but collaborative, in that they could see the comments that everyone was making on the performance level descriptors, and they were commenting on the comments, and so that was really useful. And they were also in the training doing feedback questionnaires about the training and about, you know, giving me their thoughts. And so all of that feedback I was able to bring into the sessions, into the two discussion sessions. I had a because I only had an hour and a half in the discussion sessions, because I was paying for them. I had a very, very clear frame. I had a very clear agenda of what I was at, a script basically, because I was doing both sessions to kind of compare the decisions they came up with. So it was really important for me to have that script to keep people online. And there were a couple of strong personalities at one of the groups, so it was really yeah, it was just really interesting. And actually another of the people actually kind of came and said, I think we might be getting a bit off topic. And I was going, thank you. So it really was a bit like herding kittens at times. Probably you've experienced that too. And I think the key is to have like a very, very clear agenda of what needs to be accomplished. And also to give another thing that I thought was important was to give everybody the opportunity to assure that there was no need to agree, and to give everybody the opportunity, okay, you said this, would you like to explain why you thought that? Or, you know, give everyone the opportunity to express what they were thinking about the decisions they made. Does that answer your question?
Any other questions?
Maria, I wonder if you could talk about the diagnostic dimension of the test, because I know that's quite a big part of what you've done, particularly for students who are obviously not ready. What resources have you provided for them?
Yeah, so I was incredibly lucky.
It depends on when they take the test, right?
Yes.
Whether they've got time to engage in so-called remedial activity.
So the test is designed to be taken like within a few months of transitioning from that theoretical to practical flight training, so that they can actually have time to go to the website and to do some of the improve their whatever it is. I was very lucky to be able to work with the developer of the platform that the test is on, and he was just amazing, because in the score report, their feedback is based on their test performance. And then from their test performance, they'll get suggestions on, like, you need to practice your standard phraseologies. Why don't you go to these websites and do that? So in the companion test website, there's a whole lot of resources that they're freely available to anybody, and they are free resources that from test performance. It's kind of like an audit, a language audit that people can go to and just practice. You know, it could be listening to the main idea, it could be reading, it could be speaking socially to instructors. So those resources are there. In terms of the diagnostic function, it really only, this was something that I think was actually kind of a failure, a little bit of a failure, because when you have a diagnostic test, it's really hard to diagnose to anything beyond the construct of that particular task. You really have to be there to actually investigate further. and it requires a lot more technical expertise than what I was able to bring together. So one of the shortfalls is that, and I'll give you an example. For example, there's some listening vocabulary exercises. So it could be, the problem could be with vocabulary, or it could just be with the fact that they may know the vocabulary, but they can't actually recognize it in connected speech, in the stream of connected speech. So is it a vocabulary problem, or is it actually a listening problem? And, you know, with an online administration, I don't know. So that was one thing that was disappointing for me, was just kind of not being able to diagnose I may have been diagnosing a symptom as opposed to the root cause of the problem, I suppose is what I'm saying. But having said that, I think for a student pilot, for an ab initio pilot, it would be a really good thing to do before they start their practical flight training, just to get some resources to go, some specific resources and some specific feedback, because the score report was quite detailed, to develop their competencies, their knowledge, skills, and abilities. Maybe I'll just share the link to the website in the chat. Yes, I'll look it up. Any advice? So Naz, I'll look that up right now. I didn't think of that.
Any other questions? Because I know Maria has no problems multitasking and answering questions while she's looking up the link. If not, I can ask another question. But I don't want to do that if someone else has one. I don't see any hands up. I don't know. I guess I'll just go ahead. I don't think anyone's got their hand up. My question is about the ABLE standard setting methods. And if I understood it right, it also takes into account task importance to the domain. Did I get that correctly? So my question to you is, that makes a lot of sense for a test like yours that's developed based on a clear domain description or a needs analysis. But what about our usual tests that, you know, our large scale tests like the IELTS or so on? If we're standard setting, which happens quite often, that a test like the IELTS is standard set for use for nurses or for doctors, or, you know, those kind of uses that we might all like not necessarily agree on. How would we do that? Would we first go and get subject matter experts to kind of judge these tasks and say how kind of important they are to the domain? Or is it not possible for kind of a generic test that's sort of almost construct irrelevant to a domain that we're standard setting?
That's a massive question, Uta.
You're welcome.
I personally think that subject matter experts should be used as much as possible in any domain analysis and any standard setting. And I know that it's incredibly hard to do that with things that say that the academic test, but actually, are they really academic when you think about the domain analysis? Not particularly. But still, you could get, I think it's really, really important that it speaks to the fundamental issue. It speaks to the fundamental validity. And I think it is really important to have some kind of validation of the test content, so that it actually really reflects the purpose, the testing purpose. I don't know, that's my feeling. What do you think, Uta?
Well, I mean, that's a fundamental problem, but test users won't be stopped making decisions, policy decisions, where tests like that are used. I'm just curious about the standard setting method itself, right? Because others don't have that part, that they're also looking at importance, right? They just look, yeah. Anyway, that's really interesting. Thank you.
That's why I chose it, because I chose it for three reasons. Like, one of the reasons is it's easy to do. Like, you don't have to have any technical expertise to do the ABLE standards. You just have to be organized and do really good training. But the other really important thing was exactly that, was the validation of test content. because this is a criterion reference test, and if you don't have a validation of test content in some sense for when you're doing the standard setting, then
well, that should probably happen before you even go into a standard setting, right? It shouldn't necessarily be the same process.
Yeah, it should, but it's nice to have it like that icing on the cake where the subject matter experts go, yeah, this is really relevant. Yeah, that's nice to think, whew, got that one right.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense.
The validation of the test content, I suppose, it happens right at the beginning when you're doing the target language use domain analysis.
That's right. Mm.
So Naz, I just put that that link into the chat box, and that's the link to the companion website. The actual tests are password protected.
Susie's got her hand up.
Hi, Maria. That's such a great talk and such a great study, and so worth all the accolades, I think. My questions follows on from the discussion from Joanna and from Utta's, but it's not, I don't have a clear articulation of it. So what I'm thinking, looking at the ICAO scale, I can see how involving subject matter experts in discussions around scales, it's very difficult for them to actually speak about language, and for language experts to understand when they're speaking about language. So, for example, I'm thinking of when people say something about someone's grammar, and it's not, it may not actually be their grammar at all that is what they're referring to, but grammar is the only word they have. So it may be lexis, or it may be even pronunciation. And then looking at the scale, it's such a difficult scale to work with, isn't it? Because actually the subconstructs are incredibly entangled. And so, for example, listening comprehension and interactional competence, as you've mobilized it, but theirs is just interactions or something, I think, isn't it? It's how you disentangle this in an operational sense for a test, but then how you get subject matter experts to understand or to even talk about any one of these constructs. I just don't. I agree with you that subject matter experts are super important, but I think, it's a whole communicative challenge just talking to them about these kinds of instruments and about constructs, especially when you have something set already, as you did from ICAO. So that's not even a question. I don't know what that is. Sorry. 2 minutes to answer.
Well, I suppose the way that I got around it was that, like when I was doing the performance level descriptors, they just talked in general terms about what they were hearing. So I think when you're talking about constructs for a subject matter expert, it's going to be really difficult because they're not applied linguists. So they actually have to listen, as what Utta did in her validation study. I think they need to listen to real performances or real things and comment on those real things. And then that's where the applied linguists come in. And then they have to interpret what the comments are and make those comments, turn those comments into constructs and measurable scales and things. So it is. It's really, really difficult. It's really hard because, it's the whole performance in this domain is incredibly complex and multifaceted and not just linguistically based, of course. So yeah, it just comes down to that perennial problem of LSP test developers of, how do you actually create a scale from something so complex and something that is holistic, that people within the domain usually think of as being really holistic and not kind of drilling down into the separate things that make up all of the performance.
Yeah, and communication around constructs. So I was really impressed that you used plain language for your diagnostic instrument, for instance. So the effort to bring the instrument to the users, I think, is really commendable.
Thank you.
think we've now run out of time. Thank you so much, Maria, for your really interesting talk. And I guess you can see by the number of questions you got that people were really engaged with it. And congratulations again on the award. We haven't yet got a date or a topic for our next LTRC seminar, but we'll be working on that and sending out some information as soon as possible. So thank you again all for attending, and thank you for your time, Maria.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Maria. Bye.
See you all.
Bye.